Welcome back to Proxy, everybody, and today we're going to be diving into the Dark Eldar with a little bit of an intro talking about the faction in 10th edition and what their problem is. So as you guys know, the Dark Eldar are the lowest ranked competitive faction in 40k with a 44% win rate, pretty much lower than every single other faction in the game, and most by a significant margin. So what is wrong with the Dark Eldar? What is exactly their problem? Because it seems like at first, if you read through their units don't seem that bad. In fact, a lot of them seem very similar in function and role to Craftworld Eldar units, and Craftworld Eldar obviously are the best faction in the game at the moment. At least competitively speaking, if you are a very high-skilled player. So what is it with the Dark Eldar that's actually making them so bad, right? So what we're going to do in this video is we're going to kind of talk about the problems that the Dark Eldar have, and we're going to provide some possible solutions for it. And over the next couple weeks, we're going to do a deep dive into a couple of their strategies and tactics and units and things like that to hopefully get those of you who play Dark Eldar up to speed and hopefully doing a lot better in your games. So without further ado, let us go ahead and dive right into it. But first, a quick overview of what we're going to be looking at in today's video. We're going to be looking at where the Dark Eldar are at in the competitive rankings, the major issues with the Dark Eldar in 10th edition, and how to find success with the Dark Eldar despite their pitfalls. And they do have a couple of glaring issues that we will address. Okay, so where are the Dark Eldar at the competitive scene right now? So Games Workshop has them at about 44%, and the only faction below the 45 to 55% sweet spot that they speak of. Personally, I think if you're at 45%, you're still a little bit weak and probably need a couple buffs here and there. So, being at 44 means they're definitely going to be seeing some buffs this January. And in addition to this, GW sources aren't always 100% accurate, and I think most sources have them even lower than this at, 43, or maybe even some people have them at 42% win rate in tournaments all across the world. So they are definitely at the very bottom of the stack. And competitively speaking, it is really difficult to win with Dark Eldar at any serious tournament. But why is that? Now, a lot of you, like me, being an Eldar player, look at Dark Eldar units and see a lot of strengths. We see a lot of units that can work well together. And we're like, wow, Cabalites are good, Ravagers are good, Scourges are good. Why are the Dark Eldar so terrible? Why are they doing so bad in competitive play? But it does take a little bit of a deeper dive to understand why the Dark Eldar are truly, not performing as well as they should. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that there's not a whole lot of meaningful synergy between units and the core strengths of the army, which I will go into in just a second. So what are the other major issues with the Dark Eldar in 10th edition? Well, if you look at their enhancement list, they're pretty lackluster and often conditional. Their enhancements are also really expensive for some reason. A lot of the Eldar ones are, just 15 points, and, they're not that great. Weeping Stones or, Runes of the Farseer, or Reader of the Runes, are only 15 and 20 points respectively. Fate's Messenger is only 15 points, and we know how good that is. Phoenix Gem is 25 points. That's the most expensive, but it is extremely useful. So we have a lot of useful enhancements. Other factions also have useful enhancements as well. But the Dark Eldar don't. They don't have any useful enhancements. Most of them are just subpar at best. There's only really one of them that you would consider taking all the time. Their stratagems are also pretty lackluster, with most being situational and only a few that are strong, and I'll go into why that is again in just a second. But yeah, essentially these are the three main issues facing the Dark Eldar in 10th edition, and it's really causing them a lot of strain in competitive play. And as you guys know, playing a fragile faction in 40k in competitive play is very difficult. You have to really know the army, and on top of that, you have to have available to you very powerful combos and synergies that you're able to utilize effectively, and the Dark Eldar simply do not have this, which is one of the biggest reasons why they're struggling so much. So let's go ahead and talk about the fact that there's really no meaningful synergy between the units and the core strengths of the army, and let me give you some examples of this. The first example I came across when doing a little bit of early playtesting was the fact that leader units don't do a whole lot for the units they are attached to. With the exception of the Succubus and Lilith. They're actually awesome now. They're very low cost, very cost efficient. Witches aren't that great. They're nothing to write home about, but the Succubus and or Lilith are very good for the cost, which does make sense. You know, they are witches. They're supposed to be good in combat. The Succubus is only 55 points and Lilith is 85 points, but she is well worth the cost. She is very strong. So the other leaders in the army just aren't that great. And I know what you guys are thinking. The Archon is great, Proxy Hammer. What are you talking about? Well, the Archon recently got a nerf to its ability to increase the command cost, command point cost of enemy stratagems. He can only use it on battle tactics stratagems, which is not that great. Your opponent is not often going to be spamming battle tactics stratagems. So, unfortunately, the Archon's use diminished severely after that nerf. The other thing the Archon does is allow his unit to reroll wounds, which is really good, right? However, once again, the Archon can only join Cabalites or a Court of the Archon, and you have to also be outside of a transport to use this ability. So you can't be inside of a transport shooting safely from a Raider or a Venom or whatever. You have to be outside of it, which makes you vulnerable to counterattack. And again, Dark Eldar units are very fragile, so oftentimes you will just want to stay inside of the transport most of the time. Being inside of a transport also makes the unit more efficient in the pain tokens that they have to use. Because again, the transport has power from pain, whatever it is, the venom or whatever. And then that is also going to benefit from the abilities as well as the unit shooting inside because of the firing deck special rule. So there's a lot of anti-synergy there that you lose if you hop your Archon out of the transport. Which sucks, right? The Homunculus, on the other hand, really doesn't do a whole lot for his unit either. He's not very strong, gives them a little bit of extra durability, but racks are just not that durable of a unit in general. They're definitely not what they were last edition as far as their durability goes. They do have some decent short-range shooting, but the Homunculus really doesn't add anything to that himself. Urian Rakarth is pretty good, but again, he has to be on the battlefield to, actually use some of his abilities, which in most cases you're not always going to want to do. Lastly, pain token rerolls encourage bigger units for efficiency, but Dark Eldar operate better as multiple small units or MSU. So, using pain tokens on bigger units is really efficient, but bigger units also have to be put in Raiders. Raiders are not the best units. It's Venoms. They're the superior transport choice. And on top of that, Dark Eldar like to be an army that puts a lot of pressure on your opponent on all sides of the board. So, as a Dark Eldar player, you should be wanting to spread your opponent as thin as possible so you can gang up on isolated units, beat them up, destroy them, and then move on. And having a bunch of big units in Raiders or something like that presents a bigger target to the enemy. The other thing about Raiders is they're a little bit harder to hide. They're a little bit longer, and, they're easier to see than a Venom. So, there is that as well. I'm not saying Raiders are, not usable or anything like that, but running a whole army of Raiders for, efficiency on your pain tokens is probably not the most efficient way to run them. And again, that's a little bit of anti-synergy when considering the rerolls to hit would be more efficient with a bigger unit. So unfortunately, the Dark Eldar do have a little bit of anti-synergy going on, but that's not the only issue. Their enhancements are also pretty lackluster and are often conditional. So the Casket of Flensing, even though it's only 10 points, it only does something if an enemy fails a battle shock test, and it's a really short range. You have to be within 12 inches. And even though it is every enemy unit, you're rarely going to get more than 2 units within that range. And oftentimes you're only going to get one enemy unit to actually fail a battle shock test, which means you're only going to be getting 1 pain token. And sometimes not even that, depending on how the dice are. Labyrinthian Cunning only works on Cabalites because it's the Archon only. The Archon can really only join either the Court of the Archon or, again, the Cabalite Warriors. And unless he's using the Alliance of Agony, which is the worst stratagem in my opinion, it only refunds command points on a 4+. And once again, this is something you have to be on the battlefield for, because to target a unit with a stratagem, it needs to be on the battlefield, and if it's in a transport, it doesn't count as being on the battlefield. The Art of Pain requires you to be on the battlefield, so that's, Art of Pain, for those of you guys who don't know, gets you a pain token every turn, but you have to be on the battlefield, so you can't be hiding in a transport, which is what most of your characters are going to be doing for the vast majority of the game. Lastly, Blood Dancer improves the succubus. I think this is easily the best enhancement out of the group. It's the most useful because if you do have a succubus in your army and you do manage to get into combat, it's always going to be helpful to have. But other than that, the enhancement list is looking pretty awful. And the only one that is good is only usable on a character that is subpar at best. Yes, the succubus is very cheap and decent for a cost in combat, but nothing to write home about, especially with the way combat works in 10th edition. But what about the stratagems? We know the enhancements suck, but a lot of armies have, subpar enhancements. Their stratagems are surely good, right? Well, outside of a few, they're really not. Most are, again, situational, and only a few of them are actually strong. Strike and Fade is a standout, of course, which is the Dark Eldar equivalent of Fire and Fade, which allows you to move after shooting. That is very powerful. The Eldar have it, and so do the Dark Eldar, and it's very good. It is 2 command points, though, and unlike the Craftworld Eldar, the Dark Eldar don't have a good way to regenerate command points. So you're probably going to have to rely on tactical missions, which you should be taking with the Dark Eldar, by the way. Little helpful hint. With the Dark Eldar, because they don't have a great way to regenerate CP, you're going to probably want to go with tactical objectives so you can discard one of those objectives for the command point at the end of your turn. Not as good as an Autarch Wayleaper, of course, being able to generate the command point at the beginning of the turn, but it is something, and is something that you're probably going to have to get used to as a Dark Eldar player. Dark Eldar do also have a few survival strats, but they don't do enough to protect the very fragile Dark Eldar units, and especially when they're MSU, they're just typically not worth the command point cost. So to go into a couple of these, the Alliance of Agony requires an Archon, Succubus, and Homunculus, all to be able to be targeted, and when you do target all 3 of them, you only need to use 1 pain token to empower all 3 units. Here's the problem. They all need to be targeted, and you can't use the stratagem if even one of the units is in a transport or dead. So all 3 of them have to be alive, all 3 of them have to be outside of a transport, and realistically, to get the best use out of the command points, all of the units are going to have to be in a position to fight or shoot or something like that. If not, then it's just not a great ability whatsoever. And oftentimes, I would suggest that you don't even go for it. Pray the Weak allows wound rerolls against a below half-strength unit, but can only be used on Kabbalite units, so, basically Kabbalite warriors and Ravagers. It is good in certain circumstances, but not something you're going to be using every turn. Acrobatic Display allows Wytches and Witch Cult units to advance in charge, which is very powerful. Being able to advance in charge, especially on a fast unit, is good and something that's good to have in your back pocket. And of course, the other 2 stratagems that the Dark Eldar have are -1 to hit for non-homunculus units, and -1 to wound for homunculus units, which, again, both of those are situationally good, but not stand out and not particularly great. Okay, so now that we've talked about the weaknesses of both the enhancements, the synergy, and the stratagems of the Dark Eldar, how do you overcome these things, and how do you actually find success with the Dark Eldar despite their pitfalls? So what my advice would be is to lean heavily into the MSU style of play to maximize your board presence and secondary objective play. You need to max your secondary objectives because if you can't, you're going to fall behind on primaries very quickly. The Dark Eldar really have no way of securely holding down primary objectives in the middle of the board other than using Kabbalites to, give objectives sticky, which isn't always going to work against every opponent. I would also forgo enhancements as they are expensive and don't do a whole lot. They're basically a waste of points. You can save points and buy more units instead of using the enhancements. It's going to do much better for you. I would also get used to the idea of screening your backline with Chronos and using the Chronos to support units like Scourges and Ravagers as they are very good. The Chronos is something that is, kind of overlooked when you first look at it, but it's only 50 points and it synergizes great with Scourges for those pain token regeneration abilities. And when you shoot your Scourges, you are going to want to reroll hits because they hit on a 4+. So, being able to move them out of cover, shoot at something, hitting on 4s, but rerolling all your hits is very strong. And using a Chronos to potentially give you back that pain token is very good. And there's no limit to how many times a Chronos can do this. So if you have a couple of Chronos in the backfield and you have a couple of Ravagers and a couple of Scourges, you can potentially get half or more, if you're lucky, of your pain tokens back that you use that turn, which is very efficient. Chronoses are also very tough and resistant to indirect fire, something that Scourges are not. So if you plan on holding objectives down with, Cobblites or Scourges or something like that in your backfield, you're going to be in a little bit of trouble because they're very easy to kill. A Chronos gives you that solid monster in the backfield to be able to hold those objectives down easily. So if you're playing Dark Eldar without a Chronos, I think you're doing yourself a severe disservice. Also, when you're playing Dark Eldar, make sure to target the flanks, don't go for the middle of the board, and don't especially try to hold the center until later in the game. Turns 4 and 5 should be the turns that you are able to start coming out, holding down primary objectives in the center of the board because your opponent is crippled at that point and can't do anything to fight you off. Dark Eldar are very much an army that wants to throw a lot of stuff and pull a player in multiple different directions. And when the opponent shows a weakness or exposes a vulnerability in their line, you have the speed and the power to take advantage of that. And so that is really how you have to play Dark Eldar. You have to bait units into certain positions, and then you have to strike when they're weakest. And having fast units and transports that can respond quickly to these weaknesses is key to succeeding with the Dark Eldar. And I do know that I haven't gone into this too much, but you do also need to make sure that you have enough combat units in your army to be able to pin enemies down and engage them in close combat. You can't win a game from just shooting alone with the Dark Eldar. You need to be able to use your shooting in combination with your fast-moving combat units like Wytches and Incubi to ensure success. And this is something I do plan to talk about within the next couple of weeks when I do go into more Dark Eldar content. Also, quick shout out to my buddy on YouTube, Chris at Phoenix Gaming. He is a Dark Eldar player, an experienced one who has brought them to tournaments with some success. And, he is planning on doing a couple of Dark Eldar videos, I think next week or maybe even the week after, if I'm not mistaken. And he's a player who really leans into the combat side of Dark Eldar. So if you're looking for some Dark Eldar combat tips, go check out his channel, Phoenix Gaming. And, I think he has a good number of videos covering that, and he's going to cover more within the next week or so as well. Okay, so in conclusion, on the outside, the Dark Eldar unfortunately suffer from an apparent lack of synergy between their units, leaders, stratagems, and of course enhancements that are awful. However, looks can be deceiving, and the Dark Eldar do have a very strong secondary game and have some very fast and powerful units that when used correctly can really make an opponent sweat. And again, the problem isn't their data sheets. I think for the most part, they have good data sheets. Their problem is they lack synergy. A lot of their leaders don't really work well with the units that they're supposed to be leading and just don't have a lot of influence on the battlefield whatsoever. And to give you an example of this from the Eldar Index, by comparison, Eldar leaders have a lot of synergy with a lot of units in their index. Farseers of both types give meaningful buffs to the units that are around them. And Autarch Wayleapers are able to boost the leadership of the units that are around them as well so that they don't have to, deal with battle shock as much. So there's a lot of useful things that synergize together in the Eldar book. Unfortunately, in the Dark Eldar book, the Dark Eldar leaders just don't have the same synergy with their units, and all of their buffs require them to be outside of transports to work properly, something that the Dark Eldar really don't want to do unless absolutely necessary. So, unfortunately, there is some anti-synergy going on, and there is some weak stratagems and enhancements in the index as well. However, they do have pretty strong data sheets, like I said before, that can be used very effectively in-game. And we are going to be talking about those different interactions within the next couple of weeks as well. All right, everybody, that is going to be it for today's video. Thanks for watching. Thanks to all my patrons and supporters who have supported the channel over the last weeks and months. Your help has greatly improved the channel and helped it grow significantly. If you do want to join and help support the channel, I have free trials activated, which grant you permanent access to our Discord community, which is a community of Eldar players and enthusiasts who like to talk about strategy, tactics, and of course, hobbying. I will go ahead and leave the link for that in the description for those of you interested. I'm also an Amazon affiliate and have a channel store page, so if you are looking for some discounted Eldar miniatures or looking to pick up some Eldar-inspired apparel to rep your local game store, check out those links in the description. They do help the channel as well. Lastly, I do have an Eldar Kickstarter going on, so, if you're interested in checking out the Eldar Knights fan decks project and maybe supporting that as well, I will have a link for that in the description also. All right, everybody, that's going to be it for today. See you guys later. Have some great games this weekend, and I'll see you in the next video. Have a good one, everybody. Peace out.